As much as there has ever been consensus in the United States, Americans agree the Iraq War was a disaster, a mistake. But what really happened in the Iraq War? What led to the decision to go to war? What events powered an international consensus about the need to remove Saddam Hussein from power? How did this war really happen? And in the aftermath of Saddam Hussein's removal, why the surge in 2006? And why the decision to leave in 2011 and return just 3 years later? Without understanding the answers to all of these questions, what lesson can we learn from the war in Iraq? It's time to look back without bias and honestly ask, how did this happen? In this first episode of our 5-part series on Iraq, we look at the run-up to the Iraq War. The story of Iraq under Saddam Hussein could start at the beginning of his rise to power in the 1970s, or with the decision he made early in his reign to go to war with Iran, a war that resulted in 1 million dead and injured, that continues to influence both countries' leadership to this day, or with his campaign against the Kurds of Iraq.
Saddam Hussein was recognized by everyone as a truly evil force. We haven't mentioned the use of chemical weapons against his own population, the genocide conducted against the Kurdish people, the Anfal campaign, as many as 100,000 Iraqi Kurds killed by Saddam's army.
But to understand the dynamics that led to the Iraq War requires examining the first Gulf War, Desert Storm.
It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
The initial air phase continues in a very vigorous way. ABC's Jim Hickey reports from down in the Gulf that the second wave of air assaults has begun.
The invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990 really is a watershed for the U.S. government. It's important to recognize that. Going into that period of time, both the Reagan administration and the first Bush administration had seen Saddam Hussein as a nasty dictator, but a pragmatist, and potentially one that we could work with. We had obviously supported the Iraqis during the Iran-Iraq War against Iran, and coming out of it, the Bush administration had been hoping to become even closer to Saddam, hoping to bring him over to our side of the Cold War. They had a policy called constructive engagement with Iraq, which was all about hopefully moving Saddam in our direction. And so when Saddam decides to invade Kuwait, it's a shock for a whole variety of reasons.
Iraq will not be permitted to annex Kuwait. And that's not a threat, it's not a boast, it's just the way it's going to be.
His mindset was, why would anybody get upset if I go take over this little place and just sort of reattach it to Iraq where it really belongs?
Internationally, it was the first major display of U.S. power since Vietnam. It was a moment of almost unanimous agreement in the United Nations Security Council. And it was, with 500,000 troops on the ground, a smashing success. Hussein was crushed and ousted from Kuwait. But the decision was made not to follow him to Baghdad and remove him from power. Some regretted that decision. But at the time, the President of the United States was pleased to put what he believed would be a neat end to a successful war.
From the moment Operation Desert Storm commenced on January 16th until the time the guns fell silent at midnight 1 week ago, this nation has watched its sons and daughters with pride.
The first Gulf War ushered in a decade of international efforts to contend with the discoveries that were made in the aftermath of victory. In addition to the great victory over Saddam, there was a moment of shock for the United States government and its intelligence agencies, from Washington to London to Moscow to Beijing.
The discovery of the advanced state of his nuclear weapons program was hugely disconcerting to everybody.
We knew that he was experimenting with biological weapons, and we knew that he had a nuclear program, but as you point out, we didn't realize how far along he was until well after the war.
The world was shocked.
Not just that Saddam Hussein would use force against yet another one of his neighbors, not just that he was willing to fight the United States and the rest of the world to hold on to Kuwait, which was delusional at best, right? But also that he had made far greater progress in his weapons of mass destruction than anyone realized. And taken together, all of this frames an American perspective that Saddam Hussein is irredeemable. He has to be gotten rid of one way or another.
Intelligence communities were shocked.
WMD is really important to Saddam. It's worked, it saved his regime in the past. We were surprised after 1991 war, where our weapons assessments prior to the war was, he's a long way from a nuclear weapon. It turned out he was much closer when we uncovered all the information.
And that shock drove an almost unprecedented consensus within the United Nations Security Council to disarm Saddam Hussein, to find his weapons programs, and end them once and for all.
Our task now, consistent with our responsibilities under Chapter 7, is to establish peace in such a way that Iraq never again threatens Kuwait's sovereignty and integrity.
We all came together, including the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, to condemn this invasion and subsequently put in place a series of resolutions that become hugely important, not simply to our own decision-making, but also to the decision-making of our European allies. Most of them under Chapter 7, giving them the force of law and allowing them to be enforceable by military action. And one of these is obviously that Saddam Hussein must reveal his WMD program in full.
While the unanimity of the Security Council would eventually fray, the beginning of the decade of the 90s was marked by remarkable agreement within the UN.
Saddam, immediately after the 1991 war, he was confronted with the UN Security Council resolution, which created UNSCOM. It was UN Special Commission on Iraq. This hadn't been done before. They're supposed to account for all the weapons that Iraq had and get rid of them. And the second thing is to create a monitoring system which would provide the Security Council with assurance that Saddam isn't going to restart these programs. And the leverage on that were sanctions. So in other words, sanctions were not going to be lifted, and the deal provided by the Security Council imposed, again, this wasn't a treaty, this was an imposed onto Saddam. But you're not going to be able to sell your oil again until you satisfy these 2 requirements that this group called UNSCOM is meant to arbitrate.
First, there was complete certainty and visible evidence of a previously unknown weapons of mass destruction program under Saddam Hussein. Second, there was clear evidence, because there was a United Nations inspection team on the ground inside Iraq, of a failure to cooperate on the part of Saddam Hussein and his senior-most officials.
So he comes clean in his version of events. It's not necessarily what we would have expected, and in fact, we did miss it. And then he gets frustrated and decides, no more Mr. Nice Guy, not cooperating at all. And we get into this pattern of one crisis after another, with the Iraqis continuously blocking inspections and doing other things that created issue after issue after issue.
That lack of cooperation over several years succeeded in hardening views among the permanent members of the Security Council in Washington and in the U.S. Congress in particular about Saddam Hussein's determination to maintain his weapons programs.
The problem was that we, the weapons inspectors in the international community and intelligence agencies, were seeing, God, he lied about this, he lied about this, he lied about this. So the willingness to give him the benefit of the doubt, the trust quotient, was going in the opposite direction.
As Saddam's obfuscations grew more aggressive, frustration in Washington also grew.
That UNSCOM is back to its old games, to its old tricks.
The reason for this distressing lag in time is that Iraq never kept its side of the bargain by not making honest disclosure statements of its prohibited weapons and weapons capability, by unilaterally destroying weapons in order to ensure that the Commission would never know the full nature and scope of what it had held, and this under circumstances where the law in fact required that all destruction be conducted under international supervision.
Russians would find out about our inspections and they would warn the Iraqis, to the point where we were trying to do no-notice inspections. I don't think we ever fully succeeded in that. Our experience in UNSCOM, every once in a while we'd find cases where Saddam, for example, he imported a bunch of missile gyroscopes from Russia and did it surreptitiously in the mid-90s. What's all that about? On the truth-trust curve, that's not one for trust. And we would see repeated instances like that, which again, it built the case that Saddam would be crazy not to have WMD. The assessments by the intelligence community, especially the NIE in 2001 on WMD, which was horrible. But it wasn't the intelligence community making up stuff to satisfy political leaders. It was the intelligence community following human mindsets and biases, particularly because we got it wrong before.
There's a lot of stuff going on, and of course President Clinton has still a very ambitious domestic agenda, foreign policy agenda, and Saddam Hussein is screwing everything up. Containment is absolutely breaking down. The consensus that Saddam Hussein is a danger to the Middle East and to the world is still there. It's just being honored increasingly in the breach rather than in the observance. December 1998, some of the room will remember, we launched Operation Desert Fox, big punishing air campaign.
Indeed, in 1998, President Clinton launched airstrikes against Saddam Hussein's regime because of his failure to cooperate.
And I have no doubt today that left unchecked, Saddam Hussein will use these terrible weapons again.
And it was done for all the wrong reasons, right? The Iraqis had been delaying the inspectors, and it just got to the point where the administration felt like couldn't not use force, despite the fact that there really was no support for it, including the Saudis, the Turks, and the Jordanians. And they did something that proved to be very clever, but it's part and parcel of the same problem, which is the administration just isn't paying attention, right? And it's striking for the sake of striking. So what it basically says is hit a bunch of targets related to WMD. Well, there aren't any targets related to WMD because it's all gone, right? The inspectors can't find any at this point in time because it is all gone.
But the reality was that as the 1990s drew to a close and the sun set on the Clinton administration, the international consensus on what to do about Iraq and Saddam Hussein was fraying, while frustration with the current policy in Washington was leading to a new but different consensus on what to do.
It was the combination of all of these circumstances that led, I think, the Congress with near unanimity to conclude that the policy of containment that had been pursued since the end of Operation Desert Storm was failing, and we needed a new policy, and that was what contributed to the atmosphere that led to enactment of the Iraq Liberation Act.
H.R. 4655, an act to establish a program to support a transition to democracy in Iraq.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed. The motion to reconsider be laid upon the table, and let any statements relating to the bill appear at this point in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Congress, persuaded that the problem would never be resolved as long as Saddam Hussein was in power, moved to support his overthrow by the Iraqi opposition. The Clinton administration, perhaps more reluctantly, agreed that the policy of the United States would be regime change.
The interesting thing about the Iraq Liberation Act, he is a lawyer who worked on Capitol Hill for a long time. It was introduced in the House of Representatives on September 28th, 1998. It passed the House, passed the Senate, and went to the President within 9 days. Okay?
Something heretofore unheard of.
Despite the president's signature and the clarity of the policy outlined in the Iraq Liberation Act, by the time President George W. Bush entered the Oval Office in January of 2001, there was little enthusiasm in this new administration for any element of Iraq policy. That changed just 8 months later, on September 11th, 2001.